There's a little known tradition in baseball that happens before the start of every Major League Baseball season. Each spring, every one of the 30 Major League Baseball clubhouses is visited by a security official who gives a safety talk to all of the players. The safety talk changes a bit from year to year, but the security official never forgets to mention what is known as Major League Baseball Rule 21. It states, quote, "Any player or person connected with the club who shall promise or agree to lose, or to attempt to lose, or to fail to give his best efforts towards the winning of any baseball game with which he is or may be in any way concerned, shall be declared permanently ineligible." Rule 21 traces its roots back all the way to 1919, when 8 players for the Chicago White Sox took down the World Series for $5,000 each, nearly brought the whole game of baseball down with it. The White Sox reached the World Series that season in historic fashion when one of the franchise's all-time great players, Shoeless Joe Jackson, delivered a walk-off hit to clinch the pennant for the Sox. Shoeless Joe had already become one of the best players in the game, and his career looked like it was only on the upswing. But unfortunately, he would be swept up in the scandal that was waiting right around the corner. So what would have driven the players on the Chicago White Sox to trade a chance at a championship for a few $1,000s in cash? Well, first, I think it's important to understand how different baseball was back then than how we think of it today. Compared to the modern-day $100 million contracts, high-powered agents, and bidding wars in free agency, the lifestyle that baseball players operated under in 1919 seems almost shocking. The average salary for a professional player in 1919 was only around $3,700, which is the same as about $65,000 today. The low pay was mainly due to the fact that the players were stuck under a system known as the reserve clause that basically meant that a team's owner controlled the rights to his players pretty much unconditionally. If a player didn't accept the contract that his owner offered, then he simply couldn't play baseball that season. One of the myths surrounding the Black Sox scandal is that the owner of the team, Charles Comiskey, was especially cheap towards his players' salaries. This wasn't actually true. In fact, the 1919 White Sox were actually one of the best paid teams in the whole sport. But many of the players still struggled financially. And it's also important to understand just how widespread gambling was during this era. By the time 1919 rolled around, millions of dollars of bets were trading hands over the course of a season, which would make it the equivalent of a multi-billion-dollar industry today. And with all that money being put on games came the corruption. Now, 1919 was not the first time games had been thrown by its players. In fact, it was probably not even the first thrown World Series. Many people at the time actually believed that the World Series the year prior between the Cubs and Red Sox had also been fixed as well. All of these factors aligned and gave the White Sox players the idea to try and take a piece of the gambling riches for themselves. And so here's how it all started. In late September, a few weeks before Shoeless Joe hit his walk-off home run to win the pennant, White Sox first baseman Chick Gandil met with a gambler named Sports Sullivan at the Buckminster Hotel in Boston. Now, it's unclear whose idea it actually was to begin with, but at some point an idea was tossed out between the two men. Gamble could recruit the right players and Sullivan placed the right bets. There was nothing stopping them from making a lot of money by throwing the World Series. Chick Gandil decided he needed to focus on a few key positions in order to give them the best chance at throwing the games. His first recruit was a veteran at the end of his career, pitcher named Eddie Seacott. A few years earlier, Seacott had bought a farm in Michigan for his family to live on, and he was already struggling to pay the mortgage. Gandil was offering him a chance to pay off the farm in one fell swoop, and so, pitcher gave in to the temptation. The next player to join was shortstop Swede Risberg, followed by Risberg's closest friend, utility man Fred McMullen. After that, they pulled in another pitcher, Claude Lefty Williams. This gave them pitching control over at least 4 of the at most 9 games in the series. Now, the last pieces of the puzzle were the offensive players. Chicago had 3-star hitters who batted in succession in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th spots in the lineup. There were third baseman George Buck Weaver and outfielders Oscar Happy Felsch and Shoeless Joe Jackson. Now, recruiting among this group proved to be more challenging. Happy Felsch joined the plan basically right away. Buck Weaver listened to the scheme but eventually decided not to be part of the conspiracy. And this leaves only Shoeless Joe Jackson, whose involvement or lack of involvement is one of the most enduring mysteries of the whole scandal. Shoeless Joe was a country kid from rural South Carolina who had never learned to read or write. As a pure ball player, it's hard to understate just how good Shoeless Joe was. He had an incredible .356 career batting average, 4th best all time. Even Babe Ruth himself later claimed to have modeled his own swing after Shoeless Joe. When Chick first approached Shoeless Joe, he offered the outfielder $10,000 to join in the fix. Gandil would eventually increase the offer up to $20,000, which was more than 3 years of Shoeless Joe's salary. Unable to say no to this seemingly huge offer of wealth, Shoeless Joe gave in and agreed to join in on the scheme. It was a decision that he'd regret for the rest of his life. Now, while Gandil was recruiting players for the fix, Sports Sullivan was busy putting together the gambling connections and resources needed to make the plan work. He worked with a former ball player named Bill Burns, who acted as the intermediary between the Chicago players and the gamblers. To this very day, it is still not certain who was ultimately behind the financing of the gambling side of the scandal. One name often associated with this financing has always been a New York City gangster named Arnold Rothstein, although Rothstein would later deny his involvement when the Black Sox went on trial. Instead, he blamed one of his underlings, a former featherweight boxing champ named Abe Adel, who acted as Rothstein's bodyguard. Many people now believe that the true mastermind of the fix was actually Adel, who was just claiming to be under orders from Rothstein. Now, right before the series began, the players were given word of the final agreement from their contact, Bill Burns. Burns promised the players that they would be paid off in $20,000 installments following each White Sox loss, the best 5 of 9 series. They were also instructed to use a secret sign during the opening game to signal that the fix was on. 1919 World Series began on October 1st. Eddie Cicotte took the mound and delivered an opening strike. And then with his next pitch, the ball wildly left his hand and it struck Cincinnati leadoff hitter Maury Rath right in the back. And only the players involved in the fix knew it at the time, but Cicotte had just delivered the signal. The fix was on. Game 1 of the series went according to plan for the Black Sox. Cicotte started off pitching well, but then in the 4th inning he suddenly seemed to fall apart on the mound. Gave up hit after hit and the Reds kept scoring. The final score was a completely one-sided loss with a score of Cincinnati 9 to Chicago's 1. And after the game, the Chicago locker room was silent. Clean players were still taking in the shock of the huge defeat. The players involved in the fix were eager to collect their first round of payments for the successfully thrown game. And this is where things began to go sideways. Bill Burns delivered troubling news to the conspirators that he had no money to give them. Abe Adel, the boxer still claiming to be working under the orders of Arnold Rothstein, refused to hand over the $20,000 that the players were owed for the loss, saying that the money was all out on bets. Despite the growing reservation of the players that they might be getting ripped off, the fix in Game 2 went ahead as planned as well. White Sox lost again, but the score was closer, this time with the final of 4-2. But after the game, the same problems emerged, almost like a replay of Game 1. By now, the 2 losses totaled up to $40,000 owed to the players from Adel, but they were only paid a total of $10,000. Adel's plans was to pay them just enough to keep them on the take, keep the rest for himself. Game 3 was set to be played in Chicago, so the players had a long train ride back to think over what to do next. Eventually, at least some of the Black Sox decided that if they were not going to get rewarded for throwing away the rest of the series, then there might still be enough time to salvage a championship and save their reputations. And the truth from this point on about what the Black Sox decided to do before Game 3 is hotly debated to this day. Nobody knows for certain which players were still trying to throw the games. Later, Shoeless Joe would testify that he thought the players had tried to throw Game 3, but others on the team would claim that they had gone straight after Game 2. Even the gamblers themselves didn't know what to believe at this point. But regardless of who was still involved, the outcome of Game 3 played out very differently than the first 2 games, and Chicago won by a score of 3-0. The tension between the players and the gamblers finally exploded after Game 3. The players had been pushed far enough by the 2-timing gamblers, and they decided to take measures into their own hands for the rest of the series. They told Bill Burns that the fix was over, and they were out. But even if the players had the ability to lose a game at will, it was not nearly as easy to simply flip a switch and start winning. And even though all the players would later testify that they had tried their hardest in games 4 and 5, the White Sox lost both by scores of 2-0 and 5-0. And midway through Game 6, things were looking even more hopeless. Cincinnati jumped out to a 4-0 lead, and Reds fans were preparing for the victory celebration. But then all of a sudden, life returned to the White Sox lineup, and this was led by clutch hitting from Shoeless Joe. White Sox rallied to tie the score up at 4, and eventually they won the game in extra innings. After the Game 6 win, the team had renewed energy, and it carried into their best game the next day in Game 7. Sox took an early lead, and Seacott pitched brilliantly, holding the Reds to just 1 run. Suddenly, after 2 wins in a row, around the sport, people started to consider if the White Sox might really pull off the comeback. Series has now gotten close enough to make many involved in the gambling world nervous. The way events played out before Game 8 is probably the most controversial piece of the whole scandal. For a long time, the accepted narrative was that one of the groups of gamblers whose money was on the game took matters to their own hands and threatened to do harm to pitcher Lefty Williams and his family if he didn't throw the game. But although this traditional story has been largely debunked, that doesn't necessarily mean that the players didn't receive increased pressure, maybe even outright threats, to return to the fix if the series became tight once again. And we'll most likely never know whether or not he planned on fixing Game 8. But even so, Lefty Williams took the mound and he blew up in the first inning. He let up 3 runs, only recording 1 out before he was pulled. White Sox tried hard to fight back, but the series ended in a 10-5 loss. For Cincinnati fans, the feeling was of course elation, but other places rumors started to swirl that a fix might have taken place. And although a reporter by the name of Hugh Fullerton worked hard to investigate and expose the scandal in the 1920 offseason, his writing was largely dismissed by most mainstream sports publications. There seemed to be no appetite to investigate the potential scandal, and everyone involved in the fix was ready to move on. The next spring and summer went according to expectations, with the White Sox playing well and battling for yet another American League pennant in a tight race against New York and Cleveland. But then when everything seemed to be almost forgotten, an unrelated scandal brought the Black Sox back into the spotlight. Near the end of the 1920 season, a meaningless game between the Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies began to sprout rumors of a fix. The Cubs owner, William Wrigley, pushed a local judge to convene a grand jury to investigate. And of course, as soon as the public heard the news that a Chicago baseball team was going to be investigated for throwing a game, questions began to resurface about the Black Sox. It seemed foolish to investigate a random game but leave out the previous year's World Series. And the Chicago White Sox players themselves started to receive intense public pressure to testify before the grand jury. Pitcher Eddie Seacott especially started to worry that he was going to be called to testify. During an off day, he spoke to the team lawyer about how he should proceed. The lawyer encouraged him to confess in exchange for potential immunity. Seacott took the advice, and although he had not been formally called to testify, he shocked the sports world when he voluntarily went before the grand jury, made a full confession of the plot. Soon after, Shoeless Joe and Lefty Williams also came forward to confess, acting under the same promises of immunity which would end up being a lie. And once the court had these confessions, it was as if a dam had broken. Each one of the other players involved in the fix had their names revealed to the press one by one. Eventually, the 8 players were all charged with conspiracy to defraud the public and ordered to testify in court. First trial of the 8 accused conspirators began on June 27, 1921 and lasted all the way until August 2nd, captured the whole nation's attention and was filled with drama. And when these accused players themselves took the stand to testify for their defense, suddenly their stories came out very differently than they had in confessions a few months earlier. And this, combined with the fact that the original copies of those confessions had mysteriously disappeared from the court records before the trial, cast doubt on the whole standing of the charges that had been so tied with the confessions. It's unclear to this day where those confessions went, but on August 2nd, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury came forward with their verdict, an acquittal for all the players involved. And in a bizarre twist, there was jubilation in the courtroom after the verdict was announced, and the players and jury themselves celebrated the outcome together. But this victory would not last long. In 1920, baseball appointed its first commissioner, a former judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Using his new authority, Landis wasted no time in issuing an edict about the 8 players' fates. Now, this edict is infamous, and it reads, quote, "Regardless of the verdict of juries, no player who throws a ball game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers, where the ways and means of throwing baseball games are discussed, and does not promptly tell his club about it, will ever play professional baseball." The ruling was clear. The Black Sox players were finished in the game of baseball as long as Landis had any control over the matter. And when the players received the news that they had been banned from the game of baseball for life, they were all, of course, devastated. But among the 8 players, there was only one in particular who decided to fight the ruling with everything that he had. This was, of course, Shoeless, Joe Jackson. He sued the White Sox for breach of contract and managed to get a trial in Milwaukee in 1924. Although he won the trial and was awarded $16,000 of back pay, didn't allow him back in professional baseball. Although it's still debated to this day how much Jackson was truly a part of the Black Sox fix, one thing that is certain is that Shoeless Joe loved the game of baseball. And even the ban handed down by Landis didn't end his life as a ball player. For almost 20 more years after his ban, he continued to play baseball wherever he could, mostly in semi-pro leagues throughout the South. During these years, fans still flocked to see him play, and even after he had lost his speed with age, he still managed to hit with his perfectly smooth swing. I think it's ironic that a scandal that was tied mainly to greed, Shoeless Joe proved that he would play baseball for almost nothing. But his legacy has remained for future generations as a man who loved the game of baseball and played it with purity, despite being forever associated with one of the sport's worst moments.